"If something happens to me, don't tell my family," said the wealthy man to his caregiver. When the caregiver found out why he called the police, the soft hum of medical monitors was the only sound breaking the silence in the hospital room. Walter Johnson, a 75-year-old man, stared out of the large window, his gaze lost in the grey horizon of the city. His trembling hands rested on the white sheets, while the weight of the IV hung from his arm. The cold, sterile air of the hospital mirrored the coldness Walter felt in his heart, a loneliness that didn't come from his weakened body, but from the emotional void that had consumed him for years. His mind, though tired, never stopped moving. He recalled his youth, when he was a man full of ambition, building his financial empire with effort and dedication. In those days, he believed that his success would ensure the well-being of his family, that everything he did for them. But now, in what was probably the final stage of his life, he realized how wrong he had been. His children, Robert, Angel, and Santiago, had once been his greatest pride, his reason to push forward despite the challenges. But over time he watched them change. Greed and ambition had overtaken them, distancing them from what they once were. Walter couldn't even remember the last time he felt genuine affection from any of them. Their visits had become sparse, cold, and full of an air of obligation. And now, lying in this hospital bed, he waited for a visit that never came. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Walter looked up, expecting to see one of his children, but instead a young man with a calm face and attentive eyes entered. He was wearing a nurse's uniform and pushing a cart with medical supplies. "Mr. Johnson, how are you feeling today?" the young man asked softly, professionally, as he moved closer to check the monitors by the bed. Walter glanced at him indifferently. He had been surrounded by people pretending to care for so long that he no longer expected anything more. The nurse began adjusting the heart monitor cables, not waiting for a response, accustomed to the indifference of his patients. But for some reason, Walter couldn't help but watch him more closely. There was something different about this young man, something he didn't see in others. "I've had better days," Walter muttered, finally breaking the silence. The young man smiled faintly and nodded, as if he understood more than what the words conveyed. His name was Andrew, and although he looked young, Walter sensed an unusual calm in him, as if life had already taught him some hard lessons. "It's normal to feel that way," Andrew said as he checked the IV, "but if you need anything, just let me know." Walter watched how effortlessly Andrew worked, adjusting the medical instruments. But what caught his attention wasn't his skill, but the absence of that empty, calculating look Walter had learned to detect in those around him. This young man seemed different. There was no urgency to gain anything from him, no sign that Andrew saw him as just a rich old man about to lose everything. Minutes passed in silence as Andrew worked in the room. Walter, lost in thought, remembered the last time his children had visited him. It wasn't a visit of love or concern, but a meeting disguised as compassion. Robert, his eldest, had been the most insistent that day, unable to hide his desperation when talking about his businesses, subtly begging Walter to hand over control. Angel, though physically present, was lost in her own world with the vacant look of someone spiraling into self-destruction, and Santiago, his youngest son, hadn't even bothered to show up. "They don't care about me anymore," Walter thought as he watched the day darken outside the window. He knew that to them, he was just an obstacle standing between them and their inheritance. That thought tore at him more than any illness that could ravage his body. "Do you have family?" Walter suddenly asked, breaking the silence as he looked at Andrew. The question seemed to come out of nowhere, but Walter needed to know if there was still someone in the world who understood the value of family bonds, or if everyone was doomed to betray their loved ones for money. Andrew, caught off guard by the question, paused for a moment but then answered naturally. "Not much, Mr. Johnson. My father passed away a few years ago, and my mother, well, we've lost touch. I've learned to get by on my own." The response resonated deeply with Walter. It was the same loneliness, the same void, the same feeling of being disconnected from those who should have loved you most. Perhaps that's why something about Andrew felt familiar, something that made Walter feel a little less alone. Andrew finished his work in silence, but before leaving the room, he turned to Walter once more. "If you ever need to talk, I'll be nearby. Don't hesitate to ask." Walter nodded slowly without words. When the door closed behind Andrew, the old man was once again left alone with his thoughts. But this time, the loneliness didn't feel so overwhelming. He knew that, whatever the future held, at least there was one person nearby who seemed to understand him, even if just a little. The day faded into night, and as Walter closed his eyes to sleep for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone. The morning sunlight streamed into Walter's hospital room, casting long shadows on the white walls. Though the day had begun for him, it was just an extension of the previous night, endless, cold and lonely. Walter had asked one of the nurses to notify his family about his health and the importance of visiting him. Yet, despite the seriousness of the situation, the only response he had received so far was silence. The old man sighed, sinking into the pillows that barely offered him any comfort. He remembered the days when his family treated him with kindness before money and power consumed them. Back then, Robert sought his advice on business. Angel visited regularly just to chat, and Santiago followed him everywhere with admiration in his eyes. But those days were so distant that they now seemed like memories from another life. The noise from the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Someone was approaching his room, and for a moment, Walter allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe one of his children had finally decided to show up. He sat up slightly in the bed, trying to hide his excitement behind an expression of indifference. The door opened, but instead of a familiar face, a doctor entered holding a clipboard. Walter felt a knot form in his stomach, and the hope vanished instantly. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," the doctor greeted him professionally as he reviewed the monitors and reports. "We'll be doing some routine tests today to monitor your progress. Nothing much to worry about for now." Walter nodded without saying a word. As the doctor continued his work, Walter's thoughts drifted back to his children. Did they really not care? Not even enough for a quick visit to check on him, to make sure he was still alive. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to accept it. To them, he was nothing more than an obstacle, standing between them and what they considered their right, the fortune he had spent a lifetime building. The doctor finished his checkup and left the room, leaving Walter once again in the all-too-familiar solitude. The minutes stretched into hours, and the hours into a full day. Walter had waited, hoping that at least one of his children would appear, but as the afternoon arrived, he remained alone. As the sun began to set on the horizon, the door opened again, and this time, Walter didn't lift his gaze with the same expectation. He didn't want to get his hopes up again. The sound of footsteps was light and steady, but he didn't recognize the pattern as belonging to any of his family members. "Mr. Johnson, how's your day going?" It was Andrew, the young nurse who had been caring for him over the past few days. Walter sighed, his voice more tired than he intended, just like yesterday and alone. Andrew, with his usual calmness, began checking the monitors with the same efficiency as always. But this time, the silence in the room felt heavier. He could feel the sadness emanating from Walter, a pain that didn't show in his physical health but in something much deeper. "You know," Walter suddenly said, breaking the silence, "I asked the nurses to tell my family about my condition. I told them it was serious. I thought maybe that word would get them to come. But it seems not even that is enough for them." Andrew paused for a moment, then moved closer to Walter's bed. He didn't need to be a doctor to understand that Walter's illness wasn't just affecting his body, but his soul as well. And although he didn't have much to say, he stayed there, present, listening. He knew that sometimes what people needed most wasn't words, but company. Walter looked at Andrew, and for a moment he seemed to weigh whether or not to continue speaking. Then, as if something in the young nurse's eyes gave him the trust he needed, he began to open up. "When you're young, you believe everything you do is for your family, you know? You work hard, sacrifice time, even your own happiness, all for them. You think they understand, that they appreciate it. But then one day you realize they only see you as a source of resources, as a stepping stone toward their own dreams. They no longer care about who you are, only about what you can give them." Andrew nodded slowly, not because he had experienced it himself, but because he could feel the pain in every word Walter spoke. "Robert, My eldest... Walter paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. He used to respect me, admire me, but now the only thing I see in his eyes is ambition. And don't get me wrong, it's not the kind of ambition that makes him better. It's the one that's destroying him. All he cares about is control of my businesses. He doesn't even look at me as a father anymore. The room fell into a heavy silence. And then there's Angel, Walter sighed, lost in her addictions. I can't remember the last time she looked me in the eyes. I don't know if she still sees the world the same way, or if it's all blurred for her now. He stopped again, as if the pain of talking about his children was too much to bear, but there was still more to say. Santiago. Ah, Santiago. Walter's voice softened, as if talking about him hurt even more. He was always the most charming of the three. But gambling, the bets consumed him. He doesn't even ask for help anymore because he knows I have nothing left to give. He's so deep in debt that I wonder if he even has hope of getting out. Walter let his head fall back against the pillows, exhaling all the air he had held during his confession. Andrew, with a mix of empathy and sadness in his eyes, looked at Walter without saying anything. He knew there were no words that could ease the pain of a life filled with betrayals, but he also knew that sometimes the only thing one could do was be there. So he stayed by the bed, in silence, allowing the old man to feel that he wasn't completely alone. After what seemed like an eternity, Walter spoke again, this time in a lower voice, almost a whisper. I thought one of them would come today, at least to pretend they care, but not even that. He looked at Andrew with tired eyes, but with a hidden plea in them. Sometimes I wonder if everything I did, everything I built, was in vain. Andrew, feeling the responsibility to console him, spoke softly. Sometimes the value of what we build isn't in what others do with it, but in what we did to achieve it. You worked hard for your family, for what you believed was right. That's what matters. No one can take that from you. Walter watched him for a moment, letting those words settle in his mind. He wasn't sure if they comforted him or just highlighted the sadness he already felt. But at least, for the first time in a long while, someone was there to listen. Andrew stayed for a few more minutes, adjusting the monitors and making sure everything was in order. But before he left, he paused at the door and looked at Walter one last time. I'll be here again tomorrow. If you need to talk, I'll be listening. Walter nodded, grateful, though he didn't express it in words. As Andrew left the room, the old man lay staring at the ceiling. The visit he had been waiting for hadn't come, but surprisingly, he didn't feel as alone as he had earlier in the day. And so the sun fully disappeared, giving way to the night. And while Walter still waited for his children, he was no longer sure if he even wanted to see them. The sound of tires on the rain-soaked streets was the only thing Walter could hear from his window. The weather perfectly reflected his mood, grey, monotonous, and filled with a constant sadness. In the solitude of his hospital room, Walter felt more and more like a prisoner, not just because of his physical state, but because of the emotional weight of knowing that those who should be by his side had abandoned him. No calls, no messages from his children. Nothing. As the days dragged on, Walter began to think that perhaps death would be a relief, a way to escape the constant sense of betrayal that kept him trapped. However, a small spark within him still resisted. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the faint hope that something or someone would change the circumstances he found himself in. It was on one of those grey days when the door opened softly. Andrew entered the room with his usual calm. He wheeled in the cart of medical supplies, and his presence already felt like a relief from the monotony of Walter's life. The old man had begun to notice that Andrew's company, though silent, brought him some comfort. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Andrew greeted as he began checking the monitors with his usual efficiency. Walter nodded but didn't respond immediately. Something within him had changed since they last spoke. He felt there was something different about Andrew, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Despite his youth, Andrew showed a maturity and serenity Walter hadn't seen in a long time, not even in his own children. Andrew finished checking the equipment and paused for a moment, observing Walter. He noticed something in his gaze, a weariness that came not just from his physical state, but from a deep emotional wound. "How are you feeling today?" Andrew asked, not just as part of his job, but as a genuine show of concern. Walter looked at him, weighing the words he wanted to say, and finally, with a sigh, decided to speak frankly. "Today, just like always," he answered in a low voice, "alone, empty." Andrew moved a little closer, sensing that Walter had more to say. With that same calm demeanor, he sat down in the chair beside the bed, a gesture Walter silently appreciated. "You know, Andrew," Walter continued after a few moments of silence, "when you get to my age, you realize many things that once seemed insignificant. You realize that time doesn't just take away your health, but everything you thought was important. Respect from others, trust in family, all of that disappears." Andrew nodded, keeping his focus on Walter. "I thought that after everything I did for them, for my children, for my wife, they would be here, by my side. But now I understand that it was never about what I did for them, but about what they could get from me. And now, since I have nothing more to give, they don't care about me anymore." The pain in Walter's voice was palpable. Andrew had never heard such a raw and heartbreaking confession. But what impacted him most wasn't what Walter was saying, but how he said it, without resentment, without anger, only with a deep sense of disappointment. "Robert," Walter mentioned his eldest, "he used to be different, you know. He used to have dreams, aspirations that I admired. But somewhere along the way, he got lost in ambition, and now the only thing he cares about is what he can inherit from me. It's as if I'm already dead to him." Walter paused, struggling to hold back the emotions that threatened to overflow. Andrew, unsure of what to say, simply remained silent, allowing Walter to continue. "Angel, my daughter, she drowned in her own problems. She's a woman lost in her addictions, and I can't even completely blame her. I was never present enough for her. Maybe everything that's happening is my fault. Maybe I failed as a father." Finally, Andrew spoke, his voice soft yet firm. "I don't think it's your fault, Mr. Johnson. Sometimes people make choices we can't control, no matter how much we want to help them." Walter looked at him for a moment, as if weighing those words. Despite all the pain he felt, there was something comforting about hearing Andrew's voice, as if it reminded him that not everything was lost. "Maybe you're right," Walter admitted, though his face still reflected sadness. "But that doesn't change the fact that, in the end, I'm left alone. Not even Santiago, my youngest son, seems to care enough to visit. He's trapped in debts and gambling. His life is a mess, and everything I've done for them seems to have been in vain." Andrew looked at Walter with a mix of respect and compassion. He knew that what he was hearing weren't just the words of an old man venting, but of someone who had lost everything he once valued. "It must be difficult to feel that way," Andrew said, "knowing you've done so much, yet things still didn't turn out as you hoped." Walter nodded slowly. "It's more than difficult, Andrew. It's devastating. I feel like my life has been some kind of cruel joke. I dedicated myself to them, to my family, and now here I am, on the brink of death. And they aren't here, they don't visit, they don't care." The silence in the room became heavier. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words he had just spoken had drained all the energy he had left. Andrew remained by his side, unmoving, allowing the old man to process his emotions. Finally, Walter opened his eyes and looked at Andrew with an expression of exhaustion, but also a slight sense of relief from sharing something so intimate. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this," he said with a weak smile. "I suppose I just needed to tell someone." Andrew smiled gently. "Sometimes talking to someone who's not involved is exactly what we need." Walter nodded, and for the first time in days, he felt the weight on his chest lift, even if just a little. "Thank you, Andrew," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "for listening." "Always, Mr. Johnson," Andrew responded calmly. "I'm here for whatever you need." Walter watched him in silence for a moment, as if trying to understand what made Andrew so different from everyone else around him. There was something about the young nurse that reminded Walter of his own father, a strong, honest man who had always been there for him, long before money and success came into his life. "You know, Andrew," Walter said after a long silence, "you remind me a lot of my father. He was a simple man, but with an inner strength I never fully understood until I lost him. I don't know what your life has been like, but it seems you've fought your own battles as well." Andrew was surprised by the comparison, though he didn't show it. Still, his response was honest. "We all have our battles, Mr. Johnson, but what matters is that we keep moving forward, even when things get tough." Walter smiled faintly, nodding at his words. "You're right, and I thank you for reminding me of that." Though they didn't express it in words, the bond between them had grown stronger. In Andrew, Walter had found someone he could trust, someone who didn't look at him with ambition or greed, but with genuine respect and compassion. The day continued, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Walter felt that he wasn't completely alone. Although his family had betrayed him, he had found in Andrew something far more valuable than any material wealth, a real human connection. The hospital was a maze of quiet hallways and muffled echoes. For Walter, each day in that room felt like an endless repetition of the same thing: silence, solitude, and more silence. He had stopped waiting for visits with hope. That hope had turned into resignation. He knew that even if his family did show up, it wouldn't be for him, but for what they could get from him. It was a cloudy day, one of those that seemed to crush the spirit. Walter lay in his bed, his body tired but his mind active, reflecting on the conversations he had recently had with Andrew. He still couldn't understand how someone with no obligation to him like Andrew seemed more concerned for his well-being than his own children. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Robert, his eldest son, entered with quick steps, but his face was tense. Walter watched as his son moved around the room with nervous energy, almost as if he couldn't stay still. "Dad," Robert said in a forced tone, trying to mask his true intentions with a thin layer of concern. "How are you feeling?" Walter looked at him without emotion. He had learned not to trust his son's kind words. Robert, the man he had once admired and placed all his trust in, now seemed to care about only one thing: control of the family businesses. "Like a man waiting for the inevitable," Walter replied with a hint of sarcasm, his eyes locked on Robert. "And you? How are you?" Robert paused for a moment, evaluating his father's words. He knew Walter was no longer the easily manipulated man he had been years ago, but he still tried to maintain his facade. "I'm busy, you know, the businesses, the problems, but I came because I'm worried about you, Dad," he said, moving closer to the bed. "Lately, I've been thinking that maybe it's time for you to stop worrying so much about the businesses. I could help you manage things. You shouldn't be carrying all that weight anymore." Walter smiled, but it wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was one of understanding. He knew his son too well. He knew what Robert really wanted, and it wasn't to help him lighten his load. "Oh, of course, help me," Walter nodded slowly. "You know, Robert, I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe it is time to delegate, but I'm not sure you're the right one to take on that responsibility." Robert frowned, but quickly corrected his expression. "Why would you say that? I've always been there to support you in the business. I just want what's best for you and the family." "For the family," Walter repeated, sadness evident in his voice. "What family, Robert? The one that never visits me, the one that's more interested in what they inherit than in who I am as a person, the one that pretends to care while scheming to take what I still have left." Robert tried to respond, but just then the door opened again. Angel, his sister, walked in with unsteady steps, her eyes unfocused, as if she couldn't concentrate on anything outside her own internal chaos. Gabriel, her partner, followed her with his usual calculated expression. The corrupt lawyer, always present in the family's darkest dealings, positioned himself next to Angel, subtly taking control of the situation. "Hi, Dad," Angel greeted, though her tone was absent. She barely looked at him as she sat in a chair beside the bed, swaying slightly. Walter looked at his daughter, his heart breaking. Angel, who had once been his joyful little girl, was now trapped in a self-destructive cycle she couldn't seem to escape. Her addiction to drugs, compounded by Gabriel's manipulation, had turned her into a shadow of her former self. Gabriel, on the other hand, was completely present, watching every movement. He approached Walter with a courteous smile. "Mr. Johnson, it's good to see you, in relatively good health," he said, his tone as cold as ever. Walter didn't respond immediately. Gabriel was the most dangerous of them all, and he knew it. This man had seen in Angel an opportunity to get close to the Johnson fortune, and what worried Walter most was that his daughter didn't even realize she was being used. "How fortunate I am," Walter said with irony, "to be surrounded by so much family love and support." Gabriel didn't lose his composure, but Robert began to grow increasingly impatient. Things weren't going according to plan. "Dad, what Robert is trying to say," Gabriel interjected, as if he were in control of the conversation, "is that this situation must be very stressful for you. You should let us handle your affairs. Over time, it might become more difficult for you to make complex decisions, and we want to make sure everything is in order." Walter felt the blood freeze in his veins upon hearing those words. His suspicions about Gabriel and Robert's true intentions were confirmed in that moment. It wasn't just that they wanted his fortune. They were planning to legally incapacitate him, take complete control of his businesses, and make it seem as though they were concerned for his well-being. "Oh, of course, all for my well-being, right?" Walter replied, suppressing the anger rising within him. Robert, desperate to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "Dad, we just want what's best for you. You can't handle all of this on your own anymore. It's time to trust us." Walter looked at him silently, as if seeing him for the first time. It was unbelievable how the man who had once been his greatest pride had turned into someone willing to betray his own father for money. "Don't worry about me," Walter finally said. "I'll find a way to handle things." Robert pressed his lips together, clearly frustrated, but couldn't push any further. Gabriel, always more calculating, simply observed the situation with an enigmatic smile. He knew that while this wasn't the right moment, their plan would continue. It was only a matter of time. After a few more minutes of uncomfortable conversation, the family left the room, leaving Walter alone once again. But this time, the solitude didn't overwhelm him like before. Now, he felt a growing sense of determination. He knew he couldn't trust his family, but he still had Andrew, the only one who seemed to care for him without seeking anything in return. Later that afternoon, as Walter processed everything that had happened, Andrew entered the room again. This time, Walter looked at him with newfound clarity. "Andrew," he called the young nurse over to his side, "I need to ask you a favor." Andrew approached, attentive, unsure of what Walter was going to say. "I can't trust anyone else," Walter continued, his voice heavy with seriousness. "If something happens to me, I want you to take care of everything. Don't let my family get away with their plans. I trust you, Andrew. You're the only one I can rely on." Andrew was taken aback by the intensity of Walter's words, but he nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was being asked. "I'll do everything I can, Mr. Johnson. I won't let anything happen." For the first time in weeks, Walter felt that he wasn't completely alone in this battle. With Andrew's help, he knew he could face whatever was coming. The atmosphere in the room changed. Although the shadow of betrayal still loomed over him, Walter had found an ally, someone he could trust, and as the night fell, he knew the real fight was just beginning. The morning mist slowly lifted, allowing a pale sun to filter into Walter's room. Although the day seemed peaceful, the old man's heart beat with constant unease. After his family's visit, something in him had shifted. The last veil of illusion he had about his children's love had fallen. Now, more than ever, he understood they weren't hoping for his recovery, but for his demise. That harsh and devastating reality hit him with a force he could no longer control. Walter felt exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally drained. Every movement was heavy, every thought dragged him into the dark depths of his memory. The memories of his youth, when his children were small and looked up to him with admiration, clashed with the coldness and ambition he had recently seen in their eyes. How had he failed so much as a father? How had they turned into people who prioritized money over family love? As these questions tormented him, the familiar creak of the door opening broke the silence. Andrew entered with his usual calm demeanor, pushing the medical cart. His presence, though discreet, always seemed to bring a bit of peace to Walter's internal chaos. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Andrew greeted with his usual politeness as he approached to check the monitors. "Good morning, Andrew," Walter responded, though his voice was barely a whisper. Andrew, always observant, immediately noticed the difference in Walter's tone. It was quieter, more defeated than usual. Without saying anything, he continued his routine, adjusting the wires, checking the IV. But his gaze remained attentive, waiting for Walter to be ready to speak. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, Walter sighed deeply. "Andrew," he began, his voice breaking, "I want to ask you something." Andrew froze. He knew whatever Walter was about to say wasn't just an ordinary request. He put the monitor aside and moved closer to the bed, kneeling beside Walter with the same calm as always. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, I'm here for whatever you need." Walter looked at him intently. In his eyes there was a mixture of sadness, fear, and a kind of hopelessness that Andrew hadn't seen before. "My family stores I can't trust them," Walter admitted, bitterness choking his throat. "All they care about is my money, my businesses. They don't care if I live or die, they only want what I leave behind." Andrew nodded slowly, not interrupting. He had already noticed the coldness of Walter's children during previous visits, but hearing that confession directly from the old man struck him more deeply than he had expected. "I know Robert and Gabriel are planning something," Walter continued. "I don't know the details, but I can feel it. They want to incapacitate me, make it seem like I'm no longer capable of making decisions so they can take everything I have. And Angel," Walter's voice broke for a moment, "she's no longer the daughter I knew. She's lost in her own demons and doesn't even realize what's happening around her." Andrew lowered his gaze for a moment, processing what Walter was telling him. He felt a mixture of anger and empathy for the old man. How could someone with so much power and success be so completely alone in the most critical moments of his life? "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Andrew said softly. "I've seen what they do, how they behave. I'm truly sorry you have to go through this." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if gathering the strength to say what came next. When he opened them again, his gaze was firm despite his fragility. "Andrew," he said, this time with a clearer voice, "if something happens to me, I don't want you to tell my family." The words dropped into the room like a stone in calm water. Andrew felt the air grow thicker, and the weight of Walter's request hit him hard. "Not tell them?" Andrew asked, incredulous. Walter nodded. "I don't want them to find out, at least not until it's too late for them to do anything. My family isn't here for me. They're here for what I can give them. And if I die, Andrew, they'll only see it as an opportunity to take control. I don't want to be treated like another business transaction." Andrew remained silent, struggling to find the right words. He knew Walter's situation was desperate, but he hadn't anticipated a request of this magnitude. However, seeing the seriousness in Walter's eyes, he understood that this was the last resort of a man who had no one else to turn to. "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Andrew finally said in a solemn tone. "I'll do as you ask." Walter exhaled a sigh of relief, as if at least a small part of the burden he carried had lifted. Though he didn't say it, the old man knew he had found in Andrew a trust he hadn't felt with anyone else in years. "You're a good man, Andrew," Walter said, his voice softening, "and I'm sorry to put you in this situation. I shouldn't be asking you for something like this, but I can't trust anyone else." Andrew shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure your wishes are respected." For a moment they both remained silent. The gravity of what had just transpired didn't need more words. Andrew understood that he now bore a responsibility that went far beyond his role as a nurse. He wasn't just caring for Walter's body. He was safeguarding his legacy, his dignity in his final moments. Before leaving the room, Andrew turned to Walter one last time. "Rest, Mr. Johnson. I'll take care of everything." Walter looked at him with gratitude, and though he said nothing more, his eyes reflected the trust he had placed in Andrew. Slowly, he closed his eyes, letting peace, even if temporary, wash over him for the first time in weeks. Andrew, on the other hand, left the room carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that from that moment on, he would be the silent protector of a man who had lost everything that once mattered to him, except his own dignity. Night had fallen over the city, casting a blanket of stillness over the hospital. The empty hallways and flickering lights created an atmosphere that felt darker than usual to Andrew. His steps were firm, but his mind was far from his usual tasks. Since his conversation with Walter that morning, a constant unease had lingered. The old man's words, "If something happens to me, don't tell my family," still echoed in his thoughts, laden with meaning. Andrew had accepted the responsibility without hesitation, but he now realized that what was at stake was far greater than a simple request. Walter's family, particularly Robert and Gabriel, were not merely indifferent or greedy. They were scheming something far more dangerous. More and more, Andrew felt that he couldn't sit by and do nothing. Something dark was happening, and he needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. That night, after finishing his rounds, Andrew decided it was time to act. He knew he couldn't do this alone, but he also knew who he could trust. Instead of heading to the usual break room, he took the elevator to the ground floor where Lauren, a doctor his age, and one of the few people at the hospital he had formed a true friendship with, worked. Lauren wasn't just a brilliant physician. She had a strong sense of justice, making her the perfect ally in this situation. When he arrived at the emergency department, Andrew found Lauren reviewing some files. Though she was focused on her work, she looked up with a small smile when she saw him. "Andrew, what are you doing here at this hour?" she asked, though her tone revealed she sensed something was wrong. Andrew wasted no time sitting across from her and quickly explaining everything Walter had told him that morning, as well as his growing suspicions about the conspiracy Robert and Gabriel were involved in. Lauren frowned as Andrew spoke, nervously twirling a pen between her fingers as she processed the information. "Are you sure they're manipulating the treatments?" she finally asked in a whisper. "I don't have concrete proof, but Walter is right about something." "It all seems very suspicious," Andrew replied. "Gabriel is a corrupt lawyer, and Robert is desperate to take control of the family businesses. Walter told me he feels they're intentionally weakening him, and I don't think it's just paranoia." Lauren nodded slowly, her eyes filled with concern. She knew that in the world of big business and immense wealth, these kinds of situations weren't entirely uncommon, but it still shocked her to see how power and money could turn a family into enemies. "I'm going to take a closer look at his medical records," Lauren finally said. "We need to find out if there are any irregularities in the medications he's being given, and we'll need to talk to some of the doctors treating him. If Gabriel has manipulated anyone here, there will be a trail." With that plan in mind, Lauren stood up and they both headed toward the room where the digital medical records were stored. The hospital was nearly empty at that hour, making it easier for them to move unnoticed. Lauren logged into the system, searching for Walter's file and reviewing his recent medications. Minutes passed and the tension in the air grew. As Lauren examined every detail, Andrew watched the screen, hoping that something, anything, would confirm Walter's suspicions. "Here it is," Lauren said suddenly, her voice low but filled with alarm. Andrew leaned in closer, reading the details with her. In the last few days, Walter had been given several medications that didn't align with his initial diagnosis. Some of these drugs, in high doses, could cause symptoms that would easily be interpreted as cognitive decline, which could justify a diagnosis of dementia. Robert and Gabriel had been careful, but not careful enough. "This doesn't make sense," Lauren said. "These medications shouldn't be in his treatment. They're slowly weakening him, and if this continues, they could justify legally incapacitating him. This isn't just a medical error, this seems intentional." Andrew felt a surge of anger and concern. Everything Walter had feared was happening right before their eyes, and now it was up to him and Lauren to stop it. "We need to stop this," Andrew said, his voice firm. "Yes, but we need more proof," Lauren replied. "We can't accuse Gabriel and Robert with just this. If they're manipulating the medical records, they must be working with one of Walter's doctors. If we can record a conversation between them, we'll have enough to take this to the authorities." Andrew nodded. It was a risky plan, but it was all they had. They needed solid evidence, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed by Walter's family. They decided to act that very night. Lauren and Andrew knew that Gabriel often visited the hospital, and by reviewing the visitor logs, they discovered he had a meeting with one of Walter's doctors the next morning. They decided to plant a small recording device in the meeting room, hidden among the medical files. It was a dangerous move, but they were willing to take the risk. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited for the next day. Andrew stayed by Walter's side, watching every detail, every movement of the staff who entered and left the room. He knew that every minute counted, and that Walter's fate depended entirely on what he and Lauren could accomplish. Finally, morning arrived. Andrew and Lauren made sure the recorder was in place before Gabriel and the doctor met. The wait was agonizing. Every second felt like an eternity. Andrew, watching from the hallway, kept an eye on the door while Lauren monitored the security cameras to ensure they hadn't been discovered. At last, the meeting ended, and both Gabriel and the doctor left the room, unaware of what had transpired. Andrew quickly retrieved the recorder, while Lauren reviewed the audio on her computer. What they heard left them frozen. In the recording, Gabriel spoke with a coldness that left no doubt about his intentions. He instructed the doctor on how to continue weakening Walter, manipulating the treatments, and ensuring the medical records portrayed him as mentally incapacitated. "I want the dementia diagnosis accelerated," Gabriel said. "Walter shouldn't be conscious much longer. His condition needs to worsen enough for us to act legally and take control of the businesses." Robert was also involved, mentioning the pressure he felt to gain control before his creditors discovered the truth about his financial situation. The entire plan was laid out in that conversation, and now Andrew and Lauren had the proof they needed. "We've got it," Lauren said, looking at Andrew with a mix of relief and concern. "This is bigger than I thought." Andrew nodded. He knew that what they had uncovered could save Walter, but he also understood they were up against a powerful enemy. Robert and Gabriel would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "We need to take this to the authorities," Andrew said, determined. "But we have to be careful. If they find out, we know before we're ready. They might do something even more extreme." Lauren agreed. They both knew there was no room for error. Walter's life and legacy were on the line. And now, with the evidence in their hands, the real fight was just beginning. The day had arrived with a strange sense of calm, but Andrew knew it was only the calm before the storm. After hearing the recording, both he and Lauren were fully aware of the danger they were now facing. What had once been mere suspicions had solidified into undeniable truth. Gabriel and Robert were orchestrating a meticulous plan to incapacitate Walter, take control of his companies, and rob him of everything he had built. If they didn't act swiftly, Walter could lose it all, including his life. The small audio file in their possession was now their only weapon, but also their greatest risk. If Gabriel or Robert discovered they had been recorded, it wouldn't just be their lives in danger, but Walter's as well. Andrew knew all too well that the power and influence the family wielded couldn't be underestimated. The morning passed with an unsettling normalcy. Andrew continued his rounds, administering the correct medications to Walter and ensuring everything was in order. Yet every face he saw, every moment that passed, seemed shadowed by doubt and looming danger. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Johnson?" Andrew asked as he adjusted Walter's IV. "A bit better, thanks to you, Andrew," Walter replied with a faint smile, though the exhaustion was still clear in his face. "But I can feel the time slipping away." Andrew felt a knot tighten in his stomach at those words. He knew Walter was right. The situation was more critical than anyone could imagine. "Don't worry, Mr. Johnson," Andrew said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure everything turns out right. You're not alone in this." Walter nodded, though his eyes revealed the latent fear of someone who knew danger was closing in, but felt powerless to stop it. He knew Andrew was doing more than any nurse should, and though he didn't say it aloud, he was deeply grateful for the loyalty he had found in this stranger, something his own family had failed to provide. Later, Lauren joined them, walking into the room with a heightened sense of alertness, though she tried to hide it. She had been reviewing the records and medical documents to ensure no detail had slipped through the cracks. The three of them shared a look of understanding. There was no need for further explanation. Walter already knew the basics of the plot against him, but now it was time to take things to the next level. "We have the evidence," Lauren whispered, leaning close to Walter's bed. "It's enough to stop all of this." Walter looked at both of them with relief, but also with uncertainty. "What do you plan to do with it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We're going to the authorities," Andrew said firmly. "But we have to be cautious. We can't rush this. Gabriel and Robert are powerful, and if they find out we have this recording too soon, they might take desperate measures." Walter nodded slowly. He knew his children would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The fear crept up inside him as he thought about the possible retaliation. He had tried to distance himself emotionally, but now, faced with the stark reality of what was unfolding around him, he realized just how far they were willing to go. "What can I do?" Walter asked, searching for some semblance of control in a situation that was slipping beyond his grasp. Andrew reached out and took his hand, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the old man. "Trust us, Mr. Johnson. We'll do everything we can to protect you, but I need you to be ready for what's coming. It won't be easy, and your family isn't going to take it well when they find out they've lost control." Walter took a deep breath. Andrew's words were reassuring, but they also brought the reality of the storm he was about to face, one filled with betrayal and revelations. Meanwhile, Lauren took charge of the operation. She had contacted a trustworthy lawyer outside Gabriel's influence and explained the situation in general terms without giving too much away over the phone. They both knew that to avoid tipping off Gabriel and Robert, they would have to move with extreme caution. "I'll meet with the lawyer this afternoon," Lauren informed them. "I'll hand over the recording and explain the plan. This could take a few days, but we need to move quickly." Andrew nodded, grateful to have someone like Lauren by his side, someone with the determination and intelligence to handle such a delicate situation. He knew they couldn't do this without her. The afternoon dragged on, each hour feeling like an eternity. Both Andrew and Lauren stayed on high alert, watching for any suspicious movements. They knew Gabriel and Robert could show up at any moment, and they couldn't afford a single misstep. Just as the evening began to set in, Andrew was going over some files when he heard footsteps approaching Walter's room. His heart raced. The footsteps were quick and purposeful, not the usual sound of a routine visit. The door swung open, revealing Robert with Gabriel close behind. Both entered with tense expressions, their impatience barely concealed. Andrew stood firm, though inside, every fiber of his being was ready to respond to whatever might unfold. "We need to speak to my father alone," Robert demanded, his cold eyes fixed on Andrew. Andrew had no choice but to step out of the room, but he didn't go far. He stayed just outside the door, listening intently to every word. He knew Walter was vulnerable, and while he couldn't be physically present, he would do everything he could to protect him. Inside, Robert approached the bed with a calculating expression, while Gabriel stayed in the background, observing with his usual air of manipulation. "Dad," Robert began, his tone softer than usual, but Walter wasn't fooled. "We need to talk seriously. I've been thinking about your condition and what's happening with the businesses. I think it's time you made a decision before it's too late." Walter looked at him in silence, knowing that every word from his son was part of a larger strategy. He knew Gabriel was there to oversee the process, ensuring that everything went according to their plan. "I'm not sure what decision you're asking me to make, Robert," Walter replied, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. Robert frowned, growing impatient. "You can't manage this alone, Dad. You know that. The businesses are at risk. Your health is at risk. You need to let someone else handle things. I can take care of everything and make sure there are no more problems." Walter felt his heart race. He knew this was the moment he had dreaded, the moment his son, with Gabriel's help, would try to seize complete control of his life and his businesses. Before Walter could respond, Gabriel stepped in with his usual cold, calculated tone. "It's for your own good, Mr. Johnson. We don't want you to suffer any more stress than necessary. But if you don't act soon, you might lose the chance to make any decisions at all." The words were a thinly veiled threat. Outside the door, Andrew's body tensed as he listened. He knew Robert and Gabriel were making their final push, but he also knew that thanks to the recording, their plan was about to crumble. Inside the room, Walter remained calm, though inside he was filled with a mix of anger and sadness. His own children saw him as an obstacle, not as a father. It was devastating, but he also felt stronger than ever, knowing that Andrew and Lauren were on his side. "I'll think about it," Walter finally replied, his voice firm, "but I won't be rushed into any decisions." Robert and Gabriel exchanged a look, clearly unsatisfied with Walter's response. Still, they didn't press further. They said their forced goodbyes and left the room, leaving Walter alone. Andrew immediately returned, his eyes filled with concern. "Is everything all right?" Andrew asked quietly. Walter nodded, though deep down he knew the danger hadn't passed yet, but there was something he now had that he hadn't before. Real hope. He understood that Gabriel and Robert's plan was about to fall apart, and although the battle wasn't over, at least he wasn't facing it alone anymore. The tension in the hospital was palpable. Andrew couldn't stop thinking about the last confrontation with Robert and Gabriel, and how Walter had managed to stand his ground despite the pressure from his son and the corrupt lawyer. However, the threat was still looming, and every passing minute felt like a countdown. They had the recording, but the final move was yet to be made. As the afternoon hours ticked away, Andrew was finishing his rounds in Walter's room. Despite the severity of the situation, Walter seemed more clear-headed than usual, as if something inside him had awoken with the assurance that Andrew and Lauren were fighting to protect him. "You seem calmer today," Andrew remarked as he adjusted Walter's IV. Walter observed him for a moment, his face serene though his eyes carried a deep weariness. "Calm isn't the right word," Walter replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm more prepared. I've realized that, no matter what happens, I'm not afraid anymore. What my children did hurt me more than any illness, but now I know they can't take away what I value most: my dignity." Andrew felt a lump in his throat at those words. Walter, a man betrayed by his own blood, still found the strength to stand and fight for his life, even knowing the battle ahead would be a hard one. Suddenly the door opened, and Beatrice, Walter's wife, entered with her usual cold and distant expression. It wasn't common for her to visit, and her presence seemed to add another layer of tension to the room. "Walter," Beatrice said in a tone that tried to be affectionate but came off as hollow, "we need to talk." Andrew nodded slightly, ready to leave to give them privacy, but Walter stopped him with a gesture. "Stay, Andrew. Whatever my wife has to say doesn't need to be private." Beatrice stared at him for a moment, surprised by the coldness in his words. She hadn't expected him to react so firmly. "Very well," she said through gritted teeth. "Robert and I have been talking about what's best for you, Walter. You're sick. You can't keep carrying this burden. You should sign the documents we gave you. It will be better for everyone. We don't want you to feel more pressure." Walter let out a deep sigh, looking at his wife with a mixture of sadness and disdain. "Beatrice, I've seen what you and Robert truly want for years now, and it's not my well-being that concerns you. You just want me to sign those papers so you and Robert can be done with me once and for all." Beatrice's face changed, losing its false calm. For a brief second, her true self, cold and calculating, came through, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "Don't be dramatic, Walter. We're not trying to get rid of you. But you have to admit that you can't handle everything anymore. We're just trying to help you get through this the best way possible." Walter shook his head, not even meeting her eyes. His voice lowered but grew stronger. "If you truly wanted to help me, you'd stand by my side for who I am, not for what I can give you." Andrew remained silent but alert, listening to every word. His heart pounded, knowing this conversation was just a small part of a much bigger scheme. Beatrice wasn't acting alone. Robert, and likely Gabriel too, were waiting outside the hospital plotting their next move. Beatrice stayed quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Then, with a hard look, she stood up. "Do as you wish, Walter. But sooner or later, you'll have to make a decision. You don't have much time left," she said, throwing a final warning before walking out of the room without a goodbye. Once the door closed, Andrew moved closer to Walter, who had closed his eyes, drained from the confrontation. It hadn't been a heated argument, but each word had carried emotional weight, wearing him down more than any medication could. "Are you all right, Mr. Johnson?" Andrew asked gently. Walter opened his eyes and looked at him. In his gaze was the sadness of a man who had lost the battle with his family long before any of this had started. "I'm tired, Andrew. Not from the illness, but from them. It's as if they were never really my family. I've been surrounded by people who see me only as a trophy, an opportunity to climb higher. And I can't keep pretending that doesn't affect me." Andrew sat beside Walter's bed, knowing that what the old man needed wasn't solutions, but someone to listen. "I understand, Mr. Johnson, but you're not alone in this. Lauren and I won't let them hurt you. You're not alone anymore." Walter held his gaze for a long moment. Despite the betrayal from his family, he had found something far more valuable in Andrew: genuine loyalty and empathy, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I know, Andrew," Walter said with a weak smile. "It's funny, isn't it? The person I trust most isn't my blood, but a young man I've only known for a few months. Sometimes life has a strange way of showing us who really matters." Andrew nodded silently, grateful for the trust Walter had placed in him. He knew the days ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the recording in their hands, they were one step closer to dismantling the plot Robert and Gabriel had set against Walter. At that moment, Lauren entered the room, her face filled with determination. "We need to talk," she said, looking at both Andrew and Walter. "Things are about to get more complicated. I just found out that Gabriel has been pressuring some of the doctors to fast-track Walter's diagnosis. They want to declare him legally incapacitated within days." Walter listened, his expression serious but not surprised. He had known all along that his family was pushing for this to happen as soon as possible. "What do we do now?" Andrew asked, his voice tense. "We need to take the recording to the authorities as soon as possible," Lauren replied. "But we also have to be ready for what comes next. Gabriel isn't going to sit back and do nothing. He's already moved too many pieces, and if he feels cornered, he might do something drastic." Walter listened in silence, nodding slowly. "Estoy listo para lo que venga," Walter said finally. "If you need to take this to justice, do it. I have nothing left to lose." Andrew exchanged a look with Lauren and nodded, knowing they were about to face a final battle against a family that wouldn't stop at anything to get what they wanted. With the evidence in hand and their determination to protect Walter, they knew the next step was crucial. "We'll take care of this, Mr. Johnson," Andrew said firmly. "I won't let them destroy you." As night fell over the hospital, the three of them knew that the next move would be decisive. Walter's family had reached the peak of their betrayal, and now it was up to Andrew and Lauren to ensure justice prevailed before it was too late. By 5 in the afternoon, Andrew, Lauren, and Walter knew that everything was coming to a head. The meeting with the lawyer had gone well, the recording was in safe hands, and the legal process against Gabriel and Robert had already begun. Though they had taken a major step forward, everyone could feel that the storm was just beginning. Gabriel and Robert were not the kind of people to sit back and wait for the consequences of their actions. The tension in the hospital was thick. Andrew reviewed Walter's medical records once more, making sure everything was in order, while Lauren coordinated with the authorities to ensure the next steps would be executed perfectly. There was no room for error, as any mistake could give Gabriel and Robert the chance to destroy the evidence or hasten Walter's incapacitation. Walter lay in bed, watching as Andrew and Lauren worked with near-desperate dedication. He knew they were doing everything they could to protect him, but he also knew his family would do anything to ensure their plan succeeded. The silence in the room was shattered when the door swung open. Robert stormed in first, his jaw clenched and his eyes full of rage. Behind him, Gabriel followed more composed, though the tension in his posture was clear. News of the recording reaching the authorities had gotten to them faster than Andrew had anticipated. "What do you think you're doing, Dad?" Robert spat, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Do you think you can stop us with a bunch of lies?" Walter didn't respond immediately. He looked at his son, feeling a mix of sadness and disappointment. He had expected this confrontation, but seeing it unfold before his eyes made it more painful. Robert, the son he had trusted the most, now stood before him as a stranger, driven by greed and desperation. "They're not lies, Robert," Walter replied calmly. "You and Gabriel have been planning to incapacitate me to take over my businesses. I know, and you can't hide it anymore." Robert took a step forward, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. This is all for your own good. You can't run things anymore. You're not the man you used to be. How can you be so blind?" Gabriel, maintaining his usual composure, forced a smile. "Robert is right, Mr. Johnson. No one's trying to hurt you. We just want to ensure everything is in order for your own well-being. But it seems you've decided to trust the wrong people." Gabriel shot a murderous glance at Andrew, as if his very presence were the source of all their problems. Andrew, who had remained silent until that point, stepped forward. "I'm not the problem here, Gabriel, you are. We've gathered enough evidence to prove you've been manipulating Walter's medical treatments, intentionally weakening him. This isn't about his well-being. It's about your greed." Gabriel's face darkened, though his tone remained controlled. "That's a very serious accusation, Andrew. Be careful with what you say. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Andrew replied firmly, "and now the authorities do too." Robert, completely losing his composure, took another step toward his father. "Why are you doing this, Dad? Why would you trust some nurse over your own family?" Walter looked at him, his eyes filled with deep sorrow. "Because that nurse has done more for me than any of you have in your entire lives. He's cared for me, protected me, and never once saw me as a means to get rich. Something you and your mother never understood." Robert fell silent, his lips trembling with anger. He hadn't expected to hear such harsh words from his own father, and for a moment he seemed to falter. "It wasn't just about the money, Dad," he murmured, but Walter didn't let him finish. "Don't lie to me anymore, Robert," Walter shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know what you've done. I know what you're planning. I don't want any more excuses. If you wanted to help me, you'd be here for me, not for what you can take." Robert froze, unable to respond. Walter continued, now speaking more calmly but just as firmly. "Since I entered this hospital, all I've seen is how you, Gabriel, and Beatrice have plotted to get rid of me. And yet you expect me to trust you. It's too late for that, Robert. It's far too late." Gabriel, seeing the situation slipping out of control, decided to step in once more, this time with a more threatening tone. "What Walter is saying doesn't make any sense," he said, glaring at Andrew with disdain. "This is all just a misunderstanding. There's no evidence of anything." Lauren, who had been waiting for the right moment, pulled out her phone and played the recording for Gabriel and Robert. The tension in the room skyrocketed as Gabriel recognized his own cold, calculating voice instructing the doctor to weaken Walter. "Evidence?" Lauren asked, her voice cool and professional. "We have everything we need to prove what you've been doing, and you can't escape it now." Robert paled as he heard the recording, realizing that their entire plan was about to unravel. Gabriel, though more composed, knew they had lost. "This won't end here," Gabriel said through gritted teeth. "You may have some power, but not enough to destroy me. I've been through this before, and I know how to get out of situations like this. I'm not someone you can toy with." Lauren and Andrew exchanged a glance. They knew Gabriel had connections and experience handling difficult situations, but this time he wasn't going to get away with it. "The authorities are already on their way," Lauren informed them, "and it doesn't matter who you know, Gabriel. This isn't just medical manipulation, it's fraud, and you're going to lose." Walter watched Gabriel and his son, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. He hadn't wanted things to end this way, but he knew it had been inevitable. He had lost his family long before this confrontation, and now all that remained was to face the truth. "Leave," Walter said firmly. "Get out before the authorities arrive." Robert opened his mouth to protest, but Gabriel grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the door. He knew there was nothing more they could do. As they left, Gabriel cast a final, menacing look at Andrew and Lauren. "This isn't over." And with that, they disappeared down the hallway. The room fell into silence. Walter let out a deep sigh, emotionally and physically drained. Though the battle wasn't completely over, he felt like he had taken a significant step toward freedom. Andrew stepped closer to the bed, placing a supportive hand on Walter's shoulder. "We've gotten through the worst part," Andrew said softly. "Now it's up to the authorities to handle the rest." Walter nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. He was exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was regaining control of his life. Lauren approached as well, offering a reassuring smile. "You've been very brave, Walter. Everything is going to be all right." Walter opened his eyes and looked at them both with a faint smile. "Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done it without you." Andrew and Lauren exchanged a glance, feeling satisfied that they had taken this crucial step. They knew challenges still lay ahead, but the worst was behind them. They had faced Walter's family, and with the help of the justice system, everything would soon be resolved. As night fell over the hospital, a new hope began to emerge. Walter, though physically weakened, was stronger than ever. Surrounded by people who truly valued him, he had found something that money could never buy: loyalty and genuine friendship. The air in the hospital felt lighter, but only on the surface. Though Gabriel and Robert had left after the confrontation, Andrew and Lauren knew the fight wasn't over. Outside, the grey clouds that had covered the city all day were beginning to clear, but the danger still loomed like a shadow over them. Walter, exhausted but with a newfound sense of peace, rested in his bed. His physical strength was limited, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He had faced his family, and with Andrew and Lauren by his side, he had resisted their manipulation. However, he knew Gabriel wouldn't leave things as they were. The lawyer always had a card up his sleeve, and Walter couldn't afford to let his guard down. Andrew, aware of this, was in constant contact with the authorities. They knew Gabriel had connections, and while the recording was solid evidence, they had to ensure there was no room for legal maneuvers that could save him. Robert, though less cunning, was still a key player in this web of betrayals, and he would follow Gabriel every step of the way. As the hours passed, the hospital carried on with its usual rhythm. The hum of machines, conversations in the hallways, and the occasional visit from the nurses were the backdrop to the tension still hanging in Walter's room. "Andrew!" Walter called softly. Andrew quickly approached. "Yes, Mr. Johnson?" Walter looked at him with an expression of gratitude and weariness. "I want you to know that no matter what happens from here on out, I'm at peace. I never thought someone I barely knew would end up being my greatest support in such a difficult time. What you and Lauren have done for me, I don't have the words to thank you." Andrew smiled, though his expression was serious. "There's no need to thank me, Mr. Johnson. I did it because it was the right thing to do. You don't deserve what your family has done to you." Walter nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. The conversation had tired him, but there was still something he needed to say. "I've been thinking a lot about what to do with my inheritance, and I've decided I don't want my children to receive it. I no longer consider them worthy of what I built. I want everything I have to be used to help others, to create something lasting, something that truly matters." Andrew looked at him, impressed by the decision, but he understood that Walter had thought deeply about it. "It's your decision, Mr. Johnson. I'll do everything I can to ensure your wishes are fulfilled." Walter smiled slightly, then opened his eyes and looked at Andrew with a determined gaze. "And I want you to be a part of it, Andrew. I want you to help me make sure that what I do has a positive impact. You're someone I trust, and I want you to continue what I won't be able to finish." Andrew, surprised by the offer, remained silent for a few seconds but then nodded, accepting the responsibility Walter was placing on him. "I'll do what you ask, Mr. Johnson, and I'll do it with all the respect you deserve." Their conversation was interrupted when Lauren rushed into the room, her expression serious. "Andrew, the authorities have arrived. They've started questioning some of the doctors, and Gabriel and Robert have been summoned to testify. But I just found out something else. Gabriel is trying to destroy the medical evidence that incriminates him. He's using his contacts in the hospital to alter the records and make it look like there were no irregularities in Walter's treatment." The news hit the room like a bucket of cold water. Although they knew Gabriel was capable of anything, the fact that he was trying to manipulate the records showed just how far he was willing to go to save himself. "What do we do?" Andrew asked, clearly concerned. "We have to act fast," Lauren replied. "I've already informed the officers, but we need to make sure the records are safe before they're tampered with. I'm going to talk to the head of hospital technology to block any unauthorized access." Andrew nodded, feeling the tension return to his body. The fight wasn't over, and Gabriel was using every tool at his disposal. "I'm coming with you," Andrew said, determined. Lauren nodded, and both rushed out of the room, leaving Walter to rest, though he remained aware that the fate of his life and legacy was still hanging in the balance. As they hurried through the hallways, Andrew and Lauren encountered the officers already speaking with hospital staff. The investigation was underway, but they needed time, and that was exactly what Gabriel was trying to steal from them. When they arrived at the head of technology's office, Lauren quickly explained the situation. The head, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, immediately understood the gravity of what was happening. He acted quickly, blocking access to the medical records and securing the backups to prevent anyone from altering them. "It's done," the tech chief said. "No one will be able to change anything without us knowing." Lauren sighed in relief, while Andrew nodded in gratitude. "This gives us some time," Lauren said, though her tone remained tense. "But Gabriel won't stop. He's going to try another way to manipulate the system. We have to stay alert." With the medical records temporarily secured, they returned to Walter's room. The old man greeted them with a faint smile, though he could tell by their expressions that the situation was still critical. "Is everything under control?" Walter asked, his voice weak. "For now, yes," Andrew replied. "But Gabriel isn't going to stop. He'll try anything to protect himself. The good thing is, the authorities are here, and they've already started investigating." Walter nodded slowly, closing his eyes as he processed the information. "There's no turning back for them now," Walter said. "Whatever happens, they can't hide what they've done." The hours dragged on, but with each passing minute, the web Gabriel and Robert had woven began to unravel. The doctors who had been manipulated by Gabriel started to speak up, revealing the pressures they'd faced to alter Walter's treatments. The medical records remained intact, and the evidence Gabriel had tried to destroy was safe. Finally, in the late hours of the night, the news they had all been waiting for arrived. Gabriel and Robert had been arrested, charged with fraud, manipulation of medical records, and breach of trust. Justice, though delayed, had come. Andrew and Lauren exchanged a relieved glance. They knew the battle had been tough, but they had won. Walter was safe, and the truth had come to light. When Andrew returned to Walter's room, he found the old man awake, a peaceful expression on his face. "Is it true?" Walter asked, already knowing the answer. Andrew nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, we did it. Gabriel and Robert have been arrested. They can't hurt you anymore." Walter let out a deep sigh, closing his eyes as a single tear slid down his cheek. It wasn't sadness he felt, but a profound sense of release, as though the weight of years of betrayal had finally lifted. "Thank you," Walter whispered as Andrew sat by his side, gently holding his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Andrew replied in the same soft tone. "You fought until the end." And so, in the stillness of the night, Walter Johnson, though physically exhausted, felt more alive than ever. He knew his legacy was protected, and though he had lost his biological family, he had found something far more valuable. People who had cared for and protected him without expecting anything in return. With Andrew and Lauren by his side, Walter had won the most important battle of his life, the fight for his dignity. The news of Gabriel and Robert's arrest spread quickly, and the hospital, once a silent battleground, began to return to its usual rhythm. However, inside Walter's room, the atmosphere was entirely different. For Walter, this victory over his family didn't just mean justice, it marked the end of an era, a chapter filled with betrayals, disappointments, and pain that had finally come to a close. Andrew and Lauren, relieved but still watchful, remained by Walter's side, making sure everything was in order. Justice had taken its course, but they knew the emotional toll of everything that had happened wouldn't fade easily. Walter, lying in his bed, gazed out the window. The grey days that had accompanied him for so long were beginning to give way to sunlight, but his heart still bore scars that would take time to heal. He knew he had won the battle against Gabriel and Robert, but the price had been high. He had lost not only his trust in his family, but also any hope of reconciliation. Even with his son and son-in-law behind bars, the family ties would never be the same. "Andrew?" Walter called softly, pulling the young nurse from his thoughts. Andrew quickly approached, taking a seat by his side. "Yes, Mr. Johnson?" Walter looked at Andrew with a serious expression, but there was a faint glimmer in his eyes, something Andrew hadn't seen before. Despite all the suffering, it seemed like a part of him had found peace. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next, about what I'll do with the rest of my life." Andrew nodded, listening closely. He knew this stage of Walter's life was a chance to start over, even though the path wouldn't be easy. "I've decided to donate most of my fortune to charities," Walter continued. "I don't want the money I accumulated to be used by others to follow the same path my children did. I want it to help those who truly need it." Andrew looked at him with admiration. He knew Walter was a strong man, but making such a decision after everything he had been through required immense courage. "That's a noble decision, Mr. Johnson," Andrew said. "I'm sure your legacy will help many people." Walter smiled faintly, though his eyes revealed the exhaustion of a man who had faced more than anyone should. "And you, Andrew, I want to give you something more, something that has nothing to do with money. I want you to take on the responsibility of continuing what I won't be able to finish. I want you to keep caring for those who have no one, just as you cared for me." Andrew, taken aback by the request, remained silent for a moment. He had dedicated his life to caring for others, but he never imagined someone would trust him with something so significant. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, still processing Walter's request. "You don't have to say anything," Walter responded with a smile. "Just keep doing what you've always done. Take care of others. If I've learned anything, it's that the most valuable thing we can leave behind isn't money or property, but the impact we have on people's lives. And you, Andrew, have that gift." Andrew felt a lump in his throat. Walter's words were powerful, and coming from a man who had lost almost everything, they carried even more weight. "I'll do it, Mr. Johnson," Andrew finally said, his voice filled with emotion. "I promise I will." Shortly after, Lauren entered the room with good news. The legal process against Gabriel and Robert had progressed without complications. The evidence was irrefutable, and both faced long sentences. Although Robert, in his desperation, had tried to negotiate his freedom by blaming Gabriel, there was no way to escape the inevitable. "Everything's going to be all right," Lauren said, addressing Walter with a reassuring smile. "Justice is on our side." Walter nodded, though his face showed a mix of relief and melancholy. He knew justice was important, but it didn't fill the void left by his children's betrayal. For a father, there was no greater sorrow than losing his children, not to death, but to the corruption of their hearts. "Justice is necessary, but it doesn't always bring comfort," Walter murmured. "Despite everything, I'm still their father. And that's what hurts the most." Lauren looked at him with understanding. She knew that even though Walter had stopped the plot against him, the emotional wound left behind was deep. Sometimes, justice wasn't enough to heal the soul's pain. "You don't have to carry that guilt, Walter," Lauren said softly. "They made their choices, and you did the right thing. We can't control others' actions, only our own." Walter nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words, but knowing that the emptiness in his heart wouldn't disappear so easily. "I suppose time will take care of that," he finally said. The following days were quieter. Hospital visits decreased, and the case against Gabriel and Robert moved forward in court. Andrew and Lauren continued to care for Walter, but the sense of danger had dissipated. It felt like everything was returning to a strange new normal, one where Walter, though physically weakened, found an inner peace he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Walter called Andrew and Lauren for one last conversation. "I know my time is short," Walter said with a calmness that surprised them both. "But I'm ready. I'm not afraid of what comes next. I just want to make sure everything is in order before I go." Andrew and Lauren exchanged a look of understanding. They knew what Walter meant, and though the idea of losing him was painful, they also knew he was preparing for that moment with dignity. "You have nothing to worry about," Lauren said, sitting by Walter's side. "Everything's under control, and you've done more than anyone could have in your situation." Walter smiled, satisfied. "That's what I wanted to hear." Andrew moved closer, taking Walter's hand in a silent gesture of support. He knew the end was near, but he also knew that Walter had found the peace he had long sought. "Thank you, both of you," Walter whispered, closing his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." And so, as the sun continued to set, Walter lay back in his bed, calm, surrounded by the people he trusted most. He had won the hardest battle of his life, not just against his family, but against the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. Though sadness lingered, Walter left knowing he had created a legacy far more valuable than any fortune. Love, trust, and dignity that in the end would always prevail. The days had grown quieter since Gabriel and Robert were arrested. The hospital was no longer a battlefield, and both Andrew and Lauren could feel a new chapter beginning. Walter had found the peace he so desperately sought, and although his body continued to weaken, his spirit remained strong. The storm had passed, but the calm it brought was full of reflections and farewells. Andrew, who had been by Walter's side every step of this difficult journey, noticed how the old man was slowly fading. The days were shorter, and the conversations deeper. As the end drew closer, Andrew felt a mix of sadness and gratitude, knowing he had been part of a crucial moment in Walter's life, helping him regain his dignity and face his fears. One afternoon, Walter asked to see Andrew and Lauren in his room. Despite the weakness in his body, he looked more animated than he had in days, as if something inside him had awakened. The two entered cautiously, observing the serene expression on Walter's face. "I want to talk to you about what comes next," Walter began, his voice soft but firm. "Not just for me, but for the two of you." Andrew sat by the bed while Lauren took a nearby chair, listening intently. "I've been thinking a lot about what will happen after I'm gone. I know the decisions I've made about my inheritance will have a significant impact, but I also know I can't do this alone. You two have become more than just my caretakers. You've become my family, and I want you to continue my legacy, not just with the money, but with actions that can change lives." Andrew and Lauren exchanged a look of astonishment. They knew Walter trusted them, but the magnitude of what he was saying was unexpected. "Mr. Johnson," Andrew began, his voice trembling, "we don't know what to say. What you're proposing is huge." Walter smiled, a warmth spreading across his face. "I don't expect you to respond right away. I just want you to know that I trust you both completely. I know you can do incredible things, not just for me, but for those who truly need it." Lauren, always pragmatic but moved by Walter's words, spoke next. "We will honor your wishes, not because we're in charge of your inheritance, but because we truly believe in what you represent. Throughout this process, we've seen both the best and worst in people, and your strength has taught us more than you could ever imagine." Walter nodded, satisfied with their response. He knew his time was limited, but he also knew that with Andrew and Lauren by his side, his mission to turn his pain into something meaningful would not be lost. The following days focused on organizing Walter's legal and personal matters. Although his will had already been written, with most of his fortune destined for charitable organizations, he also ensured that Andrew and Lauren would be responsible for managing certain specific projects. He wanted them to continue what he had started, helping those who lacked the opportunities he had, supporting those who, like him, had been betrayed by their closest loved ones. One morning, Walter requested to go outside to the hospital garden. Andrew and Lauren, a bit surprised by the request, helped him into a wheelchair. Walter, though frail, seemed determined to enjoy that last connection with the outside world. He knew his time was short, but he also knew he wanted to say goodbye to life with serenity. The garden was in full bloom. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of birds filled the air with an unexpected calm. Walter took a deep breath, as if trying to absorb every little detail of the moment. "You know, Andrew," Walter said, breaking the silence, "when I was young, I never imagined my life would end like this. I always thought success and money were all that mattered, but now, in these last days, I realize that's not true. What really matters are the people around you, the connections you make." Moved, Andrew sat beside him. "I'm sure you've left a mark on more people than you realize, Mr. Johnson. Your legacy won't just be in the projects you want to leave behind, but in the lives of every person you touched." Walter nodded slowly, watching the wind move the leaves of the trees. "I hope so. I don't want to be remembered just for my money, but for what I did with it. And I trust that you two will help me make that happen." Lauren, who had been observing from a distance, walked over and placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "We will, Walter, and we'll do it with all our hearts." The afternoon passed in an almost surreal peace. Despite his weakness, Walter enjoyed every second in that garden, as if he wanted to leave every thought and feeling rooted in the earth around him. For him, that moment was more than a farewell. It was the closing of a cycle filled with highs and lows, with hard but necessary lessons. The next day, Walter asked Andrew to help him write a letter. He wanted to leave behind more than just legal words in his will, something that expressed what he felt and had learned in his final days. "I want to write something for my children," Walter said, staring at the ceiling, "not to ask for forgiveness or to forgive them. I just want them to know what really matters in life because they still have time to learn, even if I no longer have hope that they will." Andrew sat down next to him with a pen and paper, and Walter began to dictate. Dear children, I know this isn't the end you expected, nor the one I wanted. The choices you've made have caused me great pain, but I don't want this letter to be about blaming you for what you did or didn't do. I only want you to understand something before it's too late for you. In life, what matters most isn't what we accumulate, but what we leave behind. And I'm not talking about money or property, but about the connections we make, the people we help, the lives we touch. No amount of wealth can buy that. No fortune can fill the emptiness of a life lived only for oneself. I hope, with all my heart, that you find something more than ambition in your lives, that you learn to see beyond money and power. If you do, maybe you'll find the peace I've found at the end. Your father, Walter. Andrew finished writing the letter, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Walter had said what he needed to say, and though he didn't know if his children would ever understand, he had done his part. As he handed the letter to Andrew, Walter reclined in his bed, closing his eyes with a peaceful expression he hadn't worn in a long time. "I think I'm ready now," he whispered, letting out a deep sigh. And in that moment, though they didn't know it yet, Walter had begun his final goodbye. The letter he had written wasn't just for his children, but for himself. It was closure, a farewell to a life full of struggles, but also an embrace of the peace he had finally found. The hospital was quiet. It was a cold early morning, and the moonlight filtered gently through the windows of Walter's room. Andrew and Lauren, who had spent the last few weeks by Walter's side, knew the end was near. Throughout those days, the old man had slowly faded away, but peacefully, like someone who had made peace with his fate. Walter had left everything prepared, his legacy, his inheritance, and above all, the message he so desperately wanted to convey to those around him. Andrew sat beside his bed, gently holding Walter's hand. Next to him, Lauren watched, always serene, though she felt a deep sadness inside. They knew the moment of farewell had arrived, but they also knew that Walter would leave this world in peace, having found what he had sought in his final days, peace and dignity. The silence in the room was broken when Walter opened his eyes, looking at Andrew with a faint smile. "It's time, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Moved, Andrew nodded softly. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, but you don't have to be afraid. We're here with you." Walter let out a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, as if preparing for what was to come. There was no fear on his face, only a sense of serenity. Someone who had done everything he could to leave the world a better place than he found it. "Thank you," Walter said, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for being with me. Until the end." Lauren approached the other side of the bed, placing a hand on Walter's arm, her face showing a mix of sadness and compassion. "You don't need to thank us, Walter. It has been an honor to be with you on this journey." Walter gave a faint smile, though the exhaustion in his body was evident. Each breath grew heavier, but his mind remained clear. The last few weeks had been a struggle, not just against his illness, but also against the shadows of the past. Now at the end he had won. "I've found what I needed," Walter whispered, his eyes still closed. "Not success or fortune, but something more valuable. People I can trust." Andrew and Lauren exchanged a glance, both holding back tears. They knew the end was near, but they also knew that Walter was ready to go. "We will carry on your legacy," Andrew said, his voice breaking with emotion. "What you've done, what you've left behind, will live on through us. I promise." Walter didn't respond immediately. His breathing slowed, but a smile remained on his face. He knew that his final words weren't necessary. What he had built with Andrew and Lauren spoke for itself. In that moment, his mission was complete. The hours passed slowly but peacefully. As the light of dawn began to fill the sky, Walter exhaled one last time. His hand in Andrew's relaxed, and his face, calm and serene, showed that, in the end, he had found the redemption he had long sought. Andrew closed his eyes, letting a silent tear fall. He knew Walter was gone, but he had left in peace, surrounded by those who truly cared for him. "He's passed," Lauren whispered, placing a comforting hand on Andrew's shoulder. "But he's gone peacefully." Andrew nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. Though he knew this moment would come, facing it was something else entirely. Still, Despite the sorrow of loss, there was a deep sense of gratitude in his heart. Walter had found what he was searching for, and that was what mattered most. In the days that followed, there was a whirlwind of emotions and legal affairs. Andrew and Lauren, as the executors of Walter's wishes, met with the lawyers to ensure everything was in order. The legal process of the inheritance was straightforward, as Walter had left clear instructions. The majority of his fortune was to go to charities supporting the most vulnerable, from homeless shelters to hospitals and educational centers. But Walter's most important legacy wasn't his money. It was the way he had touched the lives of those around him. Andrew and Lauren ensured that the foundations and projects Walter had dreamed of were put into motion. It was their way of continuing his mission, transforming the pain and betrayal he had endured into something positive, something that would help others. One of the first projects they inaugurated in Walter's honor was a center for elderly people in vulnerable situations. Andrew, with Lauren's help, oversaw every detail, ensuring the center not only provided medical care, but also a place where people could find companionship and support in their final years, something Walter had deeply valued. On the day of the opening, Andrew stood in front of the building, watching as people began to enter. A sense of fulfillment filled his chest, a satisfaction that went beyond any personal achievement. He knew Walter would be proud of what they had accomplished. Lauren, standing beside him, patted him on the shoulder. "We've done good work, Andrew," she said with a smile. "Walter would be happy to see this." Andrew nodded, looking at the sign on the entrance that bore Walter's name. "Yes, he would be," he replied, his smile reflecting both sadness and gratitude. Walter Johnson's legacy was not just preserving his fortune or businesses, but creating a lasting impact on people's lives. And though his biological family had betrayed him, he had found something far more valuable. A new family in Andrew and Lauren, who had stood by his side when he needed it most. Weeks after the center's inauguration, Andrew and Lauren organized a small ceremony to say goodbye to Walter in the place where he had asked to be remembered, the hospital garden where he had spent his last days. Surrounded by flowers and the soft sound of the wind, they held a quiet tribute in his memory. "This garden was his favorite place," Lauren said, looking around. "Here, he found the peace he had been searching for." Andrew, holding an urn in his hands, nodded. "Yes, this is where he wanted to be." Carefully, Andrew scattered Walter's ashes among the flowers, letting the wind carry them gently away. It was a simple yet profound farewell, just as Walter had requested. "Goodbye, Mr. Johnson," Andrew whispered, as the ashes blended with the earth. "Thank you for everything you taught us." Lauren placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder, and together they stood in silence, watching as the last particles of Walter's ashes drifted away on the wind. There was no sadness in that moment, only gratitude and peace. They knew Walter had left a lasting impact on their lives and many others. As they walked away from the garden, they both understood that, although Walter was no longer physically present, his legacy would continue to live on in every action they took, in every life they touched. He had been more than just a patient. He had been a mentor, a friend, and in the end, an inspiration to them both. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon, the circle closed. Walter Johnson had passed on, but his legacy of hope, generosity, and dignity would continue, carried forward by those who truly loved him. Thank you for joining us in this emotional story. If it has inspired or moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell for more tales filled with life lessons, redemption, and hope. Remember, sometimes the greatest legacy we can leave isn't material, but in the people we touch along the way. See you in the next video.